And I am pleased to introduce our Assembly Representative, Joel Kitchens. Dr. Kitchens is a large animal vet, a graduate of Ohio State University. He and his wife, Sherry, who is also with us this evening, and Sherry is a vet as well, moved to Sturgeon Bay in 1984. In addition to their busy practice, Dr. Kitchens served on the Sturgeon Bay School Board for 13 years, most of those as president of the school board. He was elected to the Assembly in 2014, and in addition to his committee work, last month Representative Kitchens was appointed to be the Assembly representative on the Wisconsin Coastal Management Council. Ladies and gentlemen, Representative Joel Kitchens.
Well, thank you, Nancy. First off, I'd like to welcome you all to beautiful Theyre County. We really appreciate you guys having your conference here. You're here at a great time of year. As you can see, the weather is great, and the tourists haven't picked up too much yet. As Nancy said, I'm lucky enough to represent Theyre and Kewaunee County, as well as some around in one township in Manitowoc County. I've represented this area for a year and a half in the Assembly now. I'm not from Theyre County originally. My family, as a kid, we moved from state to state every few years, so I'm really not from anywhere. This is sort of the only hometown that I've ever had. My wife Sherry and I, as she mentioned, we've been here since 1984. We visited Theyre County first 32 years ago, and we'd never been here. We spent an afternoon driving around, and after about 2 hours, we kind of looked at each other and said, we should move here. You know, there was no market analysis, and we went to the bank, and they determined our net worth, and they said it was minus 25,000. But this was where we wanted to be, and it's worked out very well. That was only the second time in my life that I'd fallen in love at first sight, and both times have worked out pretty well. Scoring some points here. But I'm happy to see that they have some trips planned for you while you're here, and I would really encourage you all to explore Theyre County. It's really a special place, and it is very easy to fall in love with. So since I've been elected to the Assembly, constantly people have asked me, you know, is it what you expected? And it's sort of yes and no. You know, the partisanship, the political gamesmanship, that has definitely taken some getting used to. But what really has struck me is how much more complex the issues that we deal with are than the general public realizes. Early in my term, I had some lobbyists and some colleagues. They would come to me and say, hey, I want you to support this legislation I'm proposing. And you know, they'd explain it to me, and I'd say, well, that sounds like common sense, sure. But then you find out there's another side to the story. And I regretted some of those decisions that I offered my support. So now we have a saying in my office that if an issue seems black and white, we probably don't understand it well enough. It's sort of like a variation on, you know, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. So I'm much more careful in what I commit to these days. You know, the truth down in Madison is far more elusive than people may realize. You know, we have news sources out there right now that they make a living off simplifying issues and presenting only half of the story and getting people all wound up about it. You know, people think of conservative talk radio right away, but it's on both sides. You know, especially on the internet, we have these sources that put out this information that is not the whole story. So I constantly hear from constituents, and they'll send me these articles, and they say, you know, how could you possibly support that, or you know, why are you opposed to that? But they're only seeing half of the story. And you know, as much as possible, I talk to those people if they're willing to have a civil discussion about it, and it helps. But it does often seem like it's sort of you're beating your head against a wall. You know, we've always had this kind of coverage in our country. They used to call it yellow journalism, but I think it really contributes to the partisanship and the anger that we see in our political discourse these days. So that's where the League of Women Voters comes in. You guys play a vital role in presenting the facts to people and the truth, and letting them determine, you know, after they know what's really going on. You know, it's difficult for me to gather all the facts with all the resources that I have available. I think to the average voter, it's extremely difficult. And that, again, that's where you guys come into this. I really appreciate that you encourage, you know, civil, thoughtful discussion of the issues. You know, people need to understand that the other side, you know, they're not evil, and we need to listen to their side of it, because very often there are elements of the truth, no matter how much you may disagree with them in that. You know, our country basically needs more serious debate and a lot less yelling. And we need to, and I would encourage all of you to remind yourselves, as I remind myself, that if it seems black and white, maybe I need to look at it a little more carefully. So I'm anxious to hear Bob Atwell's talk tonight on the economic case for water quality. There's no area in the country where this is more serious or important than it is here in Door County. We have more shoreline than any county on the Great Lakes, and our economy, as well as our whole way of life, is dependent on clean water. So I'm very anxious to hear that. Again, I'd like to thank all of you from the League of Women Voters for what you do and for having your conference here in Door County. So, thank you.
It's my pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker for the evening. Bob Atwell is CEO and chairman of Nicolet National Bank. He's a Green Bay business leader and a frequent speaker on a number of topics. Most important to us is on the economic case for improving water quality, which, as Representative Kitchen said, is so important here in Door County, but in all of Wisconsin. Bob is a graduate of Beloit College and the Yale School of Management, and he has worked as a Wisconsin banker for 32 years. Given that he's currently immersed in a merger with Baylake Bank, we're very lucky to have him with us this evening. So please join me in welcoming Bob Atwell.
Thank you, Andrea. I guess I'll say welcome to Door County to everyone, too. The only thing I know about how this night is going to end is I'm going to be on the last ferry to Washington Island at 9:15. So those of you who are visiting the county, don't forget that Washington Island is part of Door County. I'm honored to be here to offer some comments on Wisconsin's water quality challenges. But I first want to express my gratitude and appreciation for the work of the League of Women Voters. I'm grateful for your general work to promote a civic discourse about important matters, civic and hopefully civil. And I'm particularly grateful for your efforts in this part. Can you guys hear me? Okay, good. So if it seems like I'm going to kind of work off a script a little bit here because these are very important topics, and I have thought and spoken about these quite a bit, and I want to be fairly precise in what I say, because what I've found is when you talk about water quality issues or water issues in general, it's an emotional topic. So what are my credentials for speaking here? I'm an economist by training and a banker by trade. So I'm a community banker by trade specifically. My partner and I founded Nicolet Bank in 2000. And it's a community bank, meaning it's owned by the people we serve. All of our activities take place in this general region of northeast and north central Wisconsin. So for over 30 years, I've been a microeconomic practitioner, you might say, in this particular area. And it's inevitable, it's part of my job, I guess, to really think about issues that matter to the people here and that have to do with our future together. I did grow up in Wisconsin in the southwestern part of the state and near the Madison area. And like many Wisconsin kids, I went out into the world intending to shake the dust of this place off my feet. I hadn't really lived anywhere else, so it was sort of natural that I'd want to do that. But I found that whether I was in Washington, D.C. or New Haven, Connecticut or Germany or wherever, I couldn't get the thought of squeaky cheese curds, crisp apples, frankly, the heavy dew of a beautiful summer morning out of my heart and out of my mind. And more importantly, I couldn't shake the memory of the hardworking, good people that had been around me during my formative years. Teachers, neighbors, anybody, the people who helped me when I needed help. So I made a choice. I made a choice to come home and to stay home. My life from 1983 was tied to this place, and I made the decision that my career would have to fit this choice of place that I made. The thought of regretting that choice has never entered my mind, and tonight I'm going to offer some thoughts about water, people, and economics, the relationship between them. If I could leave you with one big thought, it would be this. What we need most in Wisconsin is we need young people to see this place as the place they want to call home. We need them to see this as the special place it is. Its physical beauty. The beauty of the community of persons who respect each other and who respect the glory of God's creation around them. We need to invite them in practical ways to participate in the work of making this place fruitful, economically, environmentally, socially, and spiritually. When I was a kid, several times a year we would drive from Verona, Wisconsin, west on Highway 18 through Iowa to southern Minnesota. How many of you are from southwestern Wisconsin? I sort of am. My mother was from southern Minnesota, so that's why we made that drive. And this route took us through the heart-rending beauty of the Driftless area, down into the confluence of the Wisconsin and Mississippi rivers at Prairie du Chien. This is the land that Ben Logan wrote about in his beautiful book, The Land Remembers. I had the occasion to bike that in the summer of 1973, which was even a better way to enjoy the beauty and the people of the area. We crossed the river on the old two-lane elevated bridge and entered McGregor, Iowa. Right when you got across the bridge, the Iowa side was plastered with signs for colored oleo. How many of you remember that? I didn't understand what that meant, and my mother had difficulty explaining it to a 10-year-old. It was like when you drive by a development and it said lots for sale. Colored oleo, lots for sale. What does any of that mean? So in those years, people who went to Kentucky would bring home a trunk full of firecrackers. People who drove through Colorado brought back cases of Coors beer, right? Even though, frankly, Special Export was a much better beer. Am I right or am I right? Apparently, people returning from Iowa were supposed to bring a trunk load of margarine. So I have 4 kids who went to Madison, and some of them have researched this issue, and they assure me that history has showed us that this strange oleo situation was the result of a well-funded campaign which used marketing and bogus science sanctioned by the federal government to convince doctors and the American public for decades that margarine was better for them than butter. The stock advice of the physician pep talk was to switch from beef to chicken, quit smoking, and switch from butter to margarine. At least they were right about the smoking, right? Well, I am very grateful for the rehabilitation of beef, butter, and bacon, which I understand is making a comeback. But seriously, the Wisconsin dairy industry at that time and the legislature responded by passing this inane law, making the use of food coloring and margarine illegal in Wisconsin. So in hindsight, Wisconsin's butter statute seems somewhere between silly and quaint. But to the agricultural lobby and the political leaders of the day, it seemed like the appropriate policy response to a very serious challenge. I'm reminding you of the margarine wars for a number of reasons. Above all, it's a stark example of the dysfunction we often find at the intersection of science, legislation, and policy. By the way, I'm going to get you off of this screen about me, if I can move this. I got it, I think. Oh, no, that's the end. Now we're really, I got to get back on track here. There you go. That's a picture of the driftless area. So we like to think that we're smarter and more sophisticated today than in the past. I wonder, and I'm sure you wonder, if this civic optimism lacks empirical foundation. Anyone studying the current political climate should wonder if we're really more sophisticated. But here's a deeper point. In the period before and after the margarine wars, Wisconsin taxpayers were contributing to federally funded water diversion projects that made large-scale agriculture in southwestern U.S. possible. We were essentially funding the primary competition to our own fruit, vegetable, and dairy producers. These subsidies definitely serve to reduce farm income here and to hasten the rapid changes in rural and small town life. Now, perhaps economists seem to think there's this exogenous or inevitable force toward consolidation, and perhaps there is. Perhaps there is such a tendency in agriculture and other industries. We won't have the opportunity to study that question in the US, as federal policies have clearly driven the industrialization of agriculture over many decades. This process has been clearly laid out by many writers. Perhaps no one's done it better than Wendell Berry. If you've read, how many of you read Wendell Berry on? This sort of get big or get out policy has been implemented in a variety of ways. The water policy, which I touched on, crop subsidies, or insurance as it's euphemistically referred to today, loan guarantees, ethanol mandates, and other policies, all of which have served to drive consolidation and scale. When I studied regulatory economics, there's a very important principle that I think is not widely understood. Probably the most important thing I learned from that is that there's a natural tendency that when you try to regulate a solution, it actually provides a relative competitive advantage to the larger producers. Pretty well-established principle. So it's hard to understand why federal policy has had such a bias toward scale. Are you guys getting bored with the whole policy discussion yet, or should I go on? Because it has something to do with us here, and it has something to do with the water there. The most benign explanation I've heard for this bias toward scale is that we want to drive food costs down for consumers. Let's make food cheaper. And that we want to encourage agricultural exports to correct our persistent trade deficits. So, okay, those are things that an economist or a reasonable person can kind of entertain. The more troubling explanations are perhaps that the companies who benefit from this industrialization have used their money and their political muscle to drive policies. It's also worth noting that industrializing and financializing agriculture and rural life in general does provide greater ability to capture tax revenue, which is of interest to governments. But one of my least favorite explanations for this policy bias toward agricultural scale is that the US, or Wisconsin, you'll hear this here, has some presumed moral responsibility to feed the world. There are many ways to hear and to respond to the cry of the poor. Industrializing food production is a clumsy way to do that. Now, when I talk like this, my friends who grew up on dairy farms are quick to remind me of how hard the work was on the family farm. Perhaps there are not enough young people today clamoring to run 120-acre farms, but there is no question that a policy bias towards scale has made that a far more difficult choice. Frankly, the biggest problem, I travel around to our 40 locations, and a lot of them are in rural towns. The biggest problem in many of these towns when you sit around the coffee table and actually talk to people is the absence of what? What's the biggest thing that Door County struggles with, for example? Yeah, economists call it labor. I would call it people. Humans are not capital, but they're people, persons. The biggest problem in these small towns that our bank serves is the absence of young people and young families in particular, because they're needed to keep the schools open, to run the volunteer fire department, the stores busy, and the church is full. There's a lot of chatter about what we call whether so-called free trade is good for the U.S. I'm not prepared to really address all that, but I can't help but wonder what cheap corn exported from the U.S. to Mexico has done to the food producers and to the social fabric of rural Mexico. Economists like to extol the importance of labor mobility. They don't like to speak of the social costs when people have little choice but to leave their homes. So this isn't a room that needs to be told that Wisconsin has very serious problems with groundwater and surface water, but there are still many people who don't know about or care about this problem. And sometimes I get people asking me as a banker, well, why is this your issue? Well, I'm pretty sure that, first of all, I'm a citizen, so I guess I get to talk about anything I want to talk about. But I'm pretty sure that most of the people and the businesses in urban northeast Wisconsin have little, if any, idea that they're going to bear the cost of about $1 billion of capital expenditures in an attempt to reduce the phosphorus in the Fox River Basin and in the Bay. We live in the center of the world's richest source of fresh water. Of all the places on Earth, it is truly mind-boggling that we should have problems with the quantity and the quality of fresh water here. Across the state, our water problems vary. In some places, it's runoff. In other places, it's plunging water tables. And in some places, it appears to be contaminated drinking water. I'm going backwards again here. If this seems kind of wonkish, I just want you to bear with me because this is the $1 billion I'm talking about. You can't see this chart very well, but what this measures is it's just phosphorus. We're just dealing with phosphorus at the mouth of the Fox River. So that's what creates the dead zone in the bay that you may have heard about, if not you should. But this is over 30 years, the level of phosphorus going into the bay. Now, some people would look at this and say it hasn't changed. Others would say it came down and then started going back up. What these dark lines are point sources. So these are the sources that the EPA has regulatory authority over. And so the water emissions from, this is a picture of the Green Bay Metropolitan Sewerage District, which has now been cleverly rebranded as NEW Water, or the Appleton, or Little Chute, or Kokana. These are, or the factories in between that have point source permits, but it's predominantly municipal sewage treatment. This measures, which is very precisely measured, the amount of phosphorus leaving those point sources. And it shows a number of things. One, point source emissions are coming down substantially. Well, not substantially, gradually. And they represent a fairly small amount of the total phosphorus entering the bay. This bar is the total maximum daily load, which is the level of phosphorus entering the bay that we're not supposed to exceed. So at that point, and that was established by a combination of, I think, the DNR and EPA. It's too complicated for me to explain, and I don't really understand it anyway, but the level exists. And so now the EPA comes in and says, well, we can't regulate all this activity. We're the EPA. We can regulate this activity under the Clean Water Act. So phosphorus is too high. We're going to do what we can do, so you point sources have to reduce it. The reason a microeconomic practitioner really dislikes this is because it's an extremely expensive way to not solve any problem. I don't mean that as I just mean, I keep going backwards, sorry. This is prepared by NEW Water, and what it's trying to show is that the estimated capital cost to comply with the new mandates from the EPA applied between Appleton at Lake Winnebago and Green Bay at the mouth of the Fox River is going to be somewhere between $800 million and $1.1 billion. For NEW Water, it's estimated to be approximately $300 million, and it will, Green Bay, NEW Water estimates that it will reduce their contribution to this from 3% to 2.5%. Very expensive, very bad policy. So that we've arrived at a point where the federal government is stepping in to tell us how to clean up the bay is not a compliment to the way we govern ourselves, right? Frankly, the way the EPA is mandating that we address the phosphorus problem in the bay is going to be very expensive and very ineffective. And these costs will be incurred by municipal treatment plants predominantly, but also by factories between Green Bay and Appleton. But do you think they're going to bear the cost? NEW Water is basically a utility. So what's going to happen is water bills will go up. And the cost of these mandates will be imposed on the people who use the water. And it frankly amounts to a very regressive form of taxation. $1 billion spread over the number of people who live in that area amounts to about $2,000 on every man, woman, and child in the lower Fox Basin, regardless of ability to pay. When I pay taxes, and I don't mind paying taxes, I don't want to say I love it, but I get it. I like to get my money's worth. And there's a lot of things wrong with the path we're on, but what I really don't like is $1 billion later, we won't really be any closer to a solution. So So the science and the economics of trying to solve these point source investments kind of point us toward what are the other sources. Well, I have talked about agriculture. I'm going to talk about agriculture, but every time you talk about water, when you talk about agriculture, everyone says, why aren't you talking about other things? Well, I have talked about other things, and I'm going to talk about what are the other ones. Point sources we talked about first, urban runoff. So that's storm sewers, right? The things that go basically right out into the water basin. Retention ponds, we sure have seen a lot of those lately. When you see new developments, they're digging retention ponds. You know, you worry about your grandchildren stumbling into them someday. And frankly, golf courses. So all the ag people that get mad at me, I'm picking on the golf courses too. I mean, golf courses use an incredible amount of stuff, and people use stuff on their lawns that winds up going into the water. But that brings us to really what's the rest of it, of all that gray area that's not point source. It essentially largely is, I think, rural runoff. And when you talk about rural runoff, well, rural areas are agricultural areas. So you're talking about crop farms, CAFOs, the large farms, mid-sized farms, which I think are under 750 animals. If you're above 750 animals, you're designated a CAFO, and you do have much more stringent regulations. And then the small farms. You know, you could just indulge me to talk a little bit about NEW, Northeast Wisconsin, which is where I actually live. There's a reason why this is a particularly hot issue in this area. Here's Door County, Kewaunee County, Brown County, Outagamie, and Manitowoc counties. When you look at the size of herds, cattle numbers by county, there's 5 counties in the state that are up in the last 30 years. 4 of them are in Northeast Wisconsin. So in Brown County, the number of animals is up 20%, Kewaunee County 33%, and Door County actually down 30%. Anyone who lives or drives the rural roads of Brown County, Outagamie County, Kewaunee, Manitowoc, or Calumet counties can see the changing face of agriculture. Like many of you, I'm listening to and learning about the creative steps that some farmers are taking to handle manure better. No one I know says that agriculture is the sole source of water issues. But there are too many in agriculture denying that cow density and crop density have anything to do with these problems. So that's really why it's such a big deal in Northeast Wisconsin. This is the number of, or the percentage increase in cows during that time period. I don't know if pointing this thing helps at all. Yeah. In Brown County, there's a land use issue, which is the number of tillable acres is down from 300,000 to 164,000 due to the growth of urban areas. So 20% more cows, about 50% less land. More cows per land, right? Per acre. There's another little factor which I won't get into all the biology of, but when you look at the amount of milk production per cow over that same time period, it's up dramatically. Probably doubling, and I'm guessing, well, there's a couple vets in the room. When you get more milk, you probably get more other stuff, right? Lynn Utesh, I think, Lynn, you sent me these pictures. These are pictures of changing agricultural practices. Particularly, I think this is Kewaunee County 2 years ago. It's a look out into Lake Michigan with the runoff. This is a picture you can barely see. You can barely see not because it's fog, but because it's wind erosion. More, boy, these are really ugly, Len. Can you click that forward, Andrea? Thank you. I'm going to give up and just ask you to click it forward when I need. Click it again. So I'm going to see blue water at death's door today, but that's not good water. Okay. I didn't study biology in college, but same thing. Okay, keep going. So, okay, now we get to the more stuff. We have issues, would be my point. And they do have something to do with agriculture. They don't have only to do with agriculture. So, much like Joel described, I do want to contribute to civic discourse here. And let me describe what I see as a citizen, a somewhat engaged person in civic life. The public discussion falls into very predictable categories, as we seem to see today. There's a presumed conflict between environmentalism and economic development, which I don't agree with. I'd like to lay this false dichotomy to rest, because aside from the work ethic, the creativity of the people who live here, work here, our most important economic resources are abundance of fresh water. If you come from outside your area and you ask yourself the question, what can this area do that it has an advantage in over anywhere else on earth? You'd say it's water. I can be characterized sometimes as being anti-agricultural, but agriculture is very important here, and it's important that it be practiced in a manner that it doesn't consume itself and squander the water resources that belong to all of us. So in the political arena, people go quickly to their corners. Leftists see the water problem as capitalist greed run amok, which must be controlled by tougher government. Frankly, the left seems blind to the incentives and the subsidies through which governments have contributed to the problem. The reflexive response on the right is to assume that we need to protect private enterprise from government intrusion, as if private prosperity had nothing to do with public investment. Both of these views proceed from a false premise. Agriculture is far from a free market. It is a flawed market. Agricultural markets shouldn't be regarded as free market capitalism in action any more than banking or healthcare should be. I'll take a drink of water here. It's good water, I think. There are plenty of hardworking and creative entrepreneurs in agriculture, and I wish I was tough enough to be a real farmer. But the decisions that farmers make about land purchases, water use, herd size, waste disposal, and capital investments take place amidst a complex web of subsidies, price supports, export initiatives, grants, mandates, and loan guarantees. The left should not presume that the government has nothing to do with the problems they see. This is a situation that does demand legislative and regulatory action, but we need a clear-eyed understanding of how clumsy and inept government initiatives can be. The right should not see agriculture as the province of the rugged, self-made homesteader carving a living from the untamed wilderness. So while our typical economic rhetoric is unhelpful, there are two microeconomic terms that I want to communicate that I think should contribute to the conversation. First, let me define them. Good job. A public good is an input to production that by its very nature cannot be owned. Anyone who thinks water can really be owned hasn't had a couple beers lately. Water is a public good. Air is a public good. Roads are a public good. Much of our education system is a public good. The strength of the US dollar and the creditworthiness of our government are public goods. All of these can and should be used by private parties, but they should always be respected as belonging to the broader public. In microeconomic theory, to avoid dysfunction in private markets, public goods should be used at a price that reflects their replacement cost. An externality is a cost of production that's not borne by the producer or by the consumer, but by the public in some other fashion. Examples of externalities are water pollution and air pollution. The financial crisis beginning in 2007 is a very relevant example of an externality created within my industry. Tremendous external costs were borne by the public after powerful financial institutions, as well as individual investors, made trillions of dollars while externalizing the cost of collapse to the public. If you think people were angry and are still angry at banks, I get it. In microeconomic theory, the most effective way to internalize an external cost is to tax it. This is why in my industry I would advocate for much higher capital levels for large institutions. As Ronald Reagan famously said, if you want more of something, subsidize it. If you want less of something, tax it. So if I wanted a lynch mob at my house, it won't help them tonight if they show up in De Pere, because I'm going to be on Washington Island. I might propose that we charge for water usage at its replacement cost and that we tax manure production, cow tax. I would be well within the murky confines of mainstream economics to do so, and I would frankly urge us to move more in this direction. Joel asked me what we should do, and I said, I don't know, Joel. I'm just a microeconomic practitioner. I'll tell you the direction I think should go. Water rights have not been much of an issue in Wisconsin until very recently. Frankly, we've had so much water, it didn't seem to matter what policy we had toward the usage of it. In cities, people receive a water bill, right? But that doesn't reflect the replacement cost. What it really represents is the cost of the infrastructure necessary to extract, deliver, and the proportionate cost of sewage treatment. The implied cost of water as a public good in urban areas has been and still is zero. But at least they have to bear the cost of cleaning it up. There's been so much water that it didn't matter if we only charged for delivery and treatment. But in recent years, we're seeing that certain parts of the state, there's a limited supply of this good. I don't get the whole what's going on with high-capacity well permits. There's people in the room smarter than I am about it, but I'm pretty sure that where the aquifer is falling, our permits still treat water as a free public good. There's permitting processes, but we don't charge for the access or the use of that water. And essentially, we treat it as if it should be free to the first party to lay claim to it. This first-to-grab policy actually accelerates the misuse of public goods. Get it before someone else does. And if we want to look forward to where this policy leads, look at the muddy end of the Colorado River and the social, environmental, and economic mess that is the state of California. There was an excellent article in the Wall Street Journal last year on how treating water as a free right of land ownership created a race to the buffet line and distorted pricing for produce made in California. I got a copy of it here if you want. Great article. Well, I would describe the agricultural policy of Wisconsin in recent decades as an effort to compete with California on California's terms. I can't think of a more foolish approach to business strategy than to compete with the worst competitor on their terms. If you find and read the Wall Street Journal article, I'd suggest you think further about the impact that California's water policy has had on Wisconsin's once formidable position as a producer of fruits and vegetables. We literally paid taxes to fund the enormous and eventually fruitless effort to capture enough water in the mountains and deliver it hundreds of miles to the Central Valley, whose growers competed with and greatly damaged our producers. California has only two prospective solutions for its chronic water shortage. These amount to massive desalination plants or sticking a straw in the Great Lakes somehow. You can bet they will expect us to pay for either, if not both of those efforts. We cannot compete with California weather, but we should not imitate their strategy. We should be figuring out how to avoid paying any more for them to compete with our farmers. We should be intentionally shaping our agriculture to prepare for the collapse that must come to California. Meanwhile, they will use every one of their 50-plus seats in the House of Representatives and their enormous clout in the Electoral College to continue attacking our producers with our money. We will, and we don't want to win a race to the bottom with California. By the way, a lot of the stress in agriculture right now has to do with the milk price. What have we really gotten for this effort to consolidate and create scale? I would be remiss if I didn't mention the importance of clean water. I'm here in Door County. I don't even need to say it. I mean, when we think about being a place where people want to be, you know, it isn't, look, I put a brave face on in winter, and I'm sure a lot of you do, those of you who don't fly south, but I live here because I absolutely love the other three seasons. I tolerate the other three seasons that are winter. I have to admit, I'm getting to the end here. Thank you for your attention. I have to admit that I have really struggled to prepare this talk, partly because it gets very emotional for people. I understand very well how important farming is to us. Almost all of us have roots in agriculture. I'm not a farmer, but I am a lifelong gardener. And when I drive by or walk by a pile of well-composted manure, I start trying to figure out where I can get a trailer. But that's a world of difference between that and the scale that we're dealing with now, whether it comes from large, medium, or small-sized farms. The productive capacity of our soil, our water, and our people is awe-inspiring. I know there's a better path than the one we're on, and I know we need to get there quickly. We have to learn to talk about this, and we have to learn to talk about this without powerful constituencies telling us to shut our mouths. So I want to offer my clearest answers to some of these questions. Do we have a water problem? Anyone here think we don't? We have problems with groundwater quality, public health problems with quality, quantity, and very obvious and growing problems with surface water quality. Period, paragraph. Is this an agricultural problem? I don't know anybody saying it's only an agricultural problem, but we are long past the point where we should admit, own, and solve the part of that that is related to agriculture. California Light is a losing economic strategy and a losing environmental strategy. Is this a CAFO problem? Some CAFO owners are very clear that they are part of the problem. Some insist that they are the cleanest operations and that herd sizes under 750 are largely unregulated, which I think that is the case. What I know is in my industry, I know how this dynamic works in banking. When there are problems in banking, the CAFO banks blame the community banks complain about the credit unions, and the government pretends like they have nothing to do with creating the problems. The DNR. This is an even more emotional topic. There is no one in the whole situation who should be doing more to define the problem, inform the public, and drive sound public policy to address it. I know there are various initiatives underway, but I don't hear any clear definition of the problem, and I don't see the drive for a solution. The DNR must show leadership. They should be concerned about this being their Flint moment. You know, I shouldn't have to stand up here publicly and try to talk about issues that they should know much more about and probably do know much more about and should be shedding light on the nature of the problem and its solutions. It shouldn't be me who gets, kind of yelled at for saying things that makes people mad. Have I made any of you mad yet? I might. It's early, I still could. What about politicians? First of all, I am grateful for people who do serve in public office. It's not an easy thing to do. But what an incredible disappointment. To paraphrase Winston Churchill, democracy is the absolute worst form of government except for all the other ones. My opinion is that our two main political parties over decades have both contributed to the mess we have in agriculture and water policies nationally and in the state. The simple fact is Republicans in Wisconsin have had a near complete control of the levers of government for over 5 years. This is their hour. I really don't see, I hear stuff, but I really don't see material progress yet in defining and addressing these problems. Locally, I'm frankly mystified why the mayors of Green Bay, Appleton, the county executives of Brown County and Outagamie counties, some of whom I know, are not making this their priority. The legislature. I warned Joel I was going to talk about this, so. If my answer seems directed to Republicans, again, it's because it's their hour, it's their moment, and therefore it's their responsibility. I'm guessing I'm probably in the political minority in this room because I've worked on campaigns and written checks for a lot of candidates, most of them Republicans. Politics is a tough business. So is medicine. So is banking. So is teaching. So is manufacturing. And so is farming. Buck up and do your job. If Republicans in Wisconsin think they have a mandate to remake Wisconsin into the land of the libertarian ungovernment, they're not listening to the people. People here want and expect what I thought I came home to in the early 80s. They want a place where the streets are clean, the water's clean, and the schools are great. Republicans control state government, frankly, because Democrats became enthralled with a brand of liberalism unsuited to the people of Wisconsin. So I'm not just making a call for a rush to the center where everyone can hold hands and sing together. I don't mind the singing and holding hands stuff. But it's really a call to get beyond your political categories and really sift through who is saying what and why they are saying it. Legislators don't represent the people who write the biggest checks. I write checks, but I don't expect them to represent me any more than anyone else. Trying to run the state with a vision imported from MoveOn.org did not work for the Democrats. Trying to conform Wisconsin to an Americans for Prosperity vision is not a very good idea either. This is not a situation that can be managed through the shallow rhetoric we see at a national level. No matter how angry it really is shallow. This is not about, and I appreciate your efforts to deepen it. This is not about keeping the government from meddling in private decisions made in free markets. If we understand that water is a public good, manure runoff is an externality, we can readily adapt positive and negative incentives to begin to make progress. If political leaders use the language of economic freedom, they should use it correctly. So, won't water and manure management increase, won't better water and manure management increase milk prices and food prices? Yes. Consumers have been benefiting from prices that don't reflect the full cost of production. That's what an externality is. And if we're concerned about the poor, this is a very silly way to go about helping them. And really the last thing I want to say is something that troubles me a lot when I talk about this or hear people talk about it, and it's this question of population. I read very well-informed people writing as if we have a huge population boom in Wisconsin that's causing some part of this problem, or the need to industrialize agriculture so we can feed the teeming hordes. What I deal with daily in my job is a population problem. It's a depopulation problem in almost every market we serve. The population is aging and declining across nearly all other counties in the state other than Dane County, Waukesha County, Brown County, Outagamie County, and maybe a couple other ones. Our demographic problem is too few people, and specifically, too few young people, young families, babies are the future of our community. We have too few people who are willing to put their hearts into loving this place, loving their neighbors, and carrying forward what most of in this room have come to love here. So the hour's late, and perhaps I've only succeeded in offending everybody. I care a lot about what's happening, and I want us to get to a better place. I'm an economist by training and a banker by trade. Nobody trusts bankers, and we all wonder why economists can't seem to be right at least half the time. But this dead zone in the Bay represents a lot of things. It's about biology, economics, and politics. But above all, it's social. At its deepest level, it represents our failure to understand, communicate, respect, and to be fair with each other. We're headed down a trail of federal intervention into what should be a community problem, community matter. You know, I drove home from Chicago last night, and this often happens when I'm on my way home. When I got north of Port Washington, I wanted to stop the car, get out, and kiss the ground I've come home to. I love this land, the blue waters of Death's Door and the gentle roll of the countryside in the southwestern part of the state. But it's the people that make this my home. It's my sincere hope to encourage a much deeper and helpful public discourse. Please don't get trapped in politics, economics, history, or science. It's about us. My four main contributions to this are, I'll just say them, you don't need the slide. Agriculture is a flawed market, not a free market. Water is a public good. It belongs to us. Manure runoff or any other form of runoff is an externality. And last, a really important line from St. Augustine, peace does not consist of the absence of conflict. Discourse is how we work through conflict. There are real issues at stake here, real parties with real money on the line over how this should happen. And we have to talk to each other. We have to insist that our leaders do a better job of leading. And I know we're up to it, but we got to get out of our corners and have at it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm a limnologist or freshwater ecologist. I found your presentation very interesting tonight. One assumption is the importance of phosphorus, and there's extensive research to show, which you already assumed in your talk, that phosphorus is the limiting nutrient and it causes undesirable algae blooms in lakes, whether they're Great Lakes or small lakes. And so you talked about point sources being regulated first, and that was done, of course, because that's the easiest thing to do. The non-point sources, as you showed very nicely in your graph, are the great majority of phosphorus loading, which is, of course, true, and the hardest to regulate. But of the things that can be done, limiting CAFOs is not the whole answer, but it's certainly the easiest one to address. CAFOs do the following thing. When herds of over 750 cows in one farm create a whole lot of manure and other wastes, one cow equals 20 humans when it comes to waste. And that accumulates all winter long, and the ground is frozen. Then when the ground thaws in April or wherever it is in the springtime, a huge phosphorus loading goes into the watershed, into the Fox River, into Green Bay. And so I would suggest that if you want to look at the easiest thing to address first, it's not the whole answer, but it's at least a starting point. We've got to somehow unite together and try to stop the addition of new CAFOs. I don't think there's much we can do about the existing CAFOs, but for new CAFOs, if you want to try to get the biggest bang for the buck in trying to reduce phosphorus loading, which is the desire of your talk, to my knowledge, that would be a good place to begin. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great statement. I don't know that I...
I live in rural Green Lake County, and my neighbor, we like to refer to him as Mr. Monsanto. We live about 20 miles from the Rosendale CAFO. He has had a habit of spreading liquid manure, and now we've had solid manure, and weekends will be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of trucks coming in and dumping stuff. We have had it, now I know because we've been researching this, our little clan, because we are at the headwater of a very pure creek that runs directly into Green Lake, who is now a threatened lake, the deepest lake in the state of Wisconsin. And so we've got this little neighborhood gang, and we watch what's going on, and after plowing the liquid manure in, it was still pooling. And more trucks kept coming. I called the DNR. Nobody home. They've got 18 officials that can now investigate these types of incidents in the state of Wisconsin because it has been gutted. I called the sheriff's department because, I mean, holy cow, what am I going to do? It was an incredible, yes, sorry about that. Never thought of that. Ooh, I like that. But there is no recourse for even if we are conscientious and know what's going on. I called Rosendale Dairy because my neighbors, that's where you'll get, but it was a weekend and they weren't there. You know, what are we going to do? And then it started to rain. It was very wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing.
Hi, I live in Franklin in Milwaukee County, and I have been talking with Milwaukee County League members and some others from around the state about how we can begin the process of looking at some of the very topics that you talked about, and especially to look at things as an economist and to look at the fact that the economy is not a static thing that's just there, sort of like the air, that it is economic policy that is set, that controls things like family farms and the quality of water. And I guess what it boils down to is we need to have more discussion on that among ourselves because the league really doesn't have, and I say the league, I'm talking national as well as state, doesn't really have a policy on the economy and public policy or market conditions and public policy. and some of the issues you talked about, especially in terms of defining public good and private good. Will you be available to be participant in that discussion?
Sure.
Great.
We'll see if I get home safely tonight.
You will. But one of the things that I really value about what you said is it's related, it's about your love for Wisconsin and about your love for this place. I come from Michigan, which in some ways is very similar, but when I came to Wisconsin to go to grad school, my thought was, okay, I'm going to go to grad school and then I'm going to go someplace exciting, like Boston or Austin, Texas, or something like that. But I fell in love with Wisconsin, and I will not leave.
Probably most of us in the room feel that way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a wonderful place, full of wonderful people. And we have the power right here to make things work for everybody. And I'd like to see that. And I like the spirituality that sort of bubbled up to the surface a couple of times, because we are people. We're not just resources to be exploited for the use of business. And I really like that perspective, that we are people, and we can make the difference. We can make the change. So I will appreciate it, and I will get your card.
Okay. I don't have a PhD in economics. I did study economics a little bit in graduate school, but definitely undergrad. And economists are like other professions. They have their jargon, and they have their way of kind of shutting down discussion, whether they consciously know it or not. And one of my pet peeves is to hear the economy spoken as a capitalized proper noun. And it's sometimes treated in social discourse as if it were almost some sort of animal to which we owe subservience, that just sort of emerged from the primordial swamps of whatever. And I think that look, all human activity takes place in a social context. So does economic activity. So there are plenty of bright economists who understand this, but there's just a natural tendency of people to use their own jargon. But we also definitely are a very materialistic society. We just are. And the language of economics and the language of policy today is driven by consumption. So we're concerned about prices to the consumer. We're not thinking about the life of the producer, right?
We have time for one more question.
Hi, I grew up in Theyre County, not too far from here, on a farm, very small farm, 120 acres, very small, and I love Theyre County, but I live in Green Bay, lived there 46 years. One thing I wanted to, I don't know if people are aware of, and I don't know if you are too, I know for like the Fox River and some of these other rivers that industry is allowed to put so much into that river, okay? Now, if an industry moves out, someone else moves into that location, they can put the same amount in. They never decrease it. They always keep that same amount that they put in there, which I don't think is very good. But another thing, I'm involved with we're called now the Clean Bay Backers, and we're out of the areas of concern through the DNR. We do the education part now. We're going to do a program coming up in September, and it's going to be a farm tour. We got 2 farms that we're going to go to. One, they're doing the new, when they plant their corn, they also plant clover between. So and everything, they try to keep the ground covered. That way there's not the runoff. The other farm is 700 cattle, or cows, but they graze them. So he doesn't have open fields either. So I think it's going to be kind of interesting. And this is through the, I forgot, I think it's through the federal government. They're getting some funding, and it's trials that they're trying to do this. They're trying to show other farmers, these large farms, that they can do this too and still make the profit. So I thought I'd just bring that up. It's coming up in September.
Thank you. Thank you all for your attention. I'm going to catch the ferry, so.
Thank you very much, Bob. That was a great